The conversation we're going to have next is with the European astronaut and former International Space Station resident, Major Timothy Peake. Tim Peake was the first British European Space Agency astronaut to visit the ISS. He launched in a Soyuz rocket on the 15th of December 2015 and landed back on Earth on the 18th of June 2016 after 186 days in space. In December 2016, Tim was made a Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George for distinguished services overseas. And we're delighted he's with us, albeit virtually, today. Welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, it's great to be joining you. It's really fantastic to be speaking to you at HeliOffshore today.
Thank you, Tim. We're really excited to be having this safety conversation with you. Before we begin, Tim, can I just remind our delegates that in order to submit any questions to Tim, please use the Ask a Question tile that's in the top left of your screen. Your questions will come through to the HeliOffshore team and they'll be selected and come through to the studio, and I'll ask Tim on your behalf. So, Tim, first question from me, I think, at this stage. But in your autobiography, you referred to the power of community during your army training at Sandhurst, and we're talking about collaboration as a theme of our conference. You talked about the unity that you experienced as you worked with a platoon. And then later on in your book, you revealed the politics and the rewards of working collaboratively with an international space community. And you've talked about the privilege of being part of an international team, making a difference at what you said was the cutting edge of something that was so much bigger than any one individual. So if we can talk about those collaborations and alliances, how do you think that we ensure within an intensely competitive environment, whether it's the military, whether it's space, whether it's offshore in our case, that all parties are able to work together to deliver and succeed?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Tim. And I think the interesting thing, of course, is that everyone's got to have a compelling goal, one that has meaning and one that has consequence, and everyone has to work towards that common goal. And when you really establish that framework, that's when true international partnerships or collaborations can work to the best of their abilities. And certainly in the space environment, when you look at the International Space Station program, it's been occupied for over 20 years, this collaboration between Russia and America, Europe, Japan, and all the member states of the European Space Agency. And it's having this partnership that allows each partner to be able to contribute something meaningful to that mission whilst all working towards a common goal, whether it's supply cargo vehicles, whether it's commercial crew spacecraft, whether it's robotic arm strategies, spacesuits for development, international packages for science modules, for example, or telecommunications modules. Each nation has their own areas of speciality and expertise, but we're all focused on a common goal, a common purpose. And that's really the key to the success of the space station. And I think it's actually probably one of the greatest achievements of the space station as well, is that kind of embracing everybody's areas of unique expertise and bringing it all together for a common purpose.
That's great. And the construction of the space station itself is an international collaboration, if I've understood it right, isn't it? Each part or each module has been built by different countries?
It is. It's a completely modular space station. I mean, frankly, the Russian segment of the space station is the old Mir space station, the same design of modules. They're just rearranged into a different shape. But essentially, that constitutes what is mainly the Russian segment. And then the US segment, as we call it, actually incorporates a Japanese module, a European module, a Canadian robotic arm. And that's changed. We're always changing the modules around, different storage vehicles going in different locations, and it's continuing to evolve. Just when I was on board, we brought up the Bigelow expandable module as a test vehicle, seeing if this is potentially the future for space stations, coming up kind of flat packed and then being expanded by air. And then that's a cheaper, more effective, more efficient way of getting space station modules into orbit. So it's constantly changing. It's very modular.
It sounds like an incredible collaborative success. Is there any room for competition at all, or is competition put completely to one side?
No, there is room. There's competition and collaboration. And, in terms of the science that's being done, of course, all the data is shared amongst the partners, and that's incredibly valuable for the benefit of people back on Earth. So that's really where, we have the, sharing of data. But there's also room for commercial activities on board the space station. And we're just starting to embrace that more and more. So we have many pharmaceutical companies that are realizing the value of doing research in microgravity. We're designing, new drugs that can combat diseases, or maybe vaccine research, for example. We've got companies doing material science on board the space station, again, that can help, for example, develop engine turbine blades that are lighter and stronger with unique metal properties. So there is room for commercial competition as well, and competition amongst the member states who are involved in this. But it's a case of just finding that sweet spot in negotiation in terms of who's contributing what, but all working in a common framework and towards a common goal.
Just coming back to working within the agency, Tim, and the collaborative effort that goes there, I'm sure there's an enormous amount of support that goes into, keeping the astronauts going, training, prepping for the trip, during the trip, and then afterwards. In terms of a collaborative effort, does the astronaut work for the space agency, or perhaps does the agency work for the astronaut?
Well, the astronaut very much works for the space agency. You certainly feel like that when you're on board the space station, rather. But of course, we're there as astronauts to be able to facilitate the purpose of the space station, either the experiments that are being conducted on board the space station and keeping it operating to the best of its ability. It's an old platform now, 20 years old. Yes, we keep modifying it. We bring up new modules, etc. But there are elements that are, of sort of 80s design that have been kept going. So it requires a lot of maintenance as well. That's our job as astronauts. So we're very much, serving the needs of the space agencies and of the space station as a platform.
And Tim, I know you've done a huge amount of training in all aspects of your life, of course, but to ensure space flight is done safely, do you train to make sure that everything goes right every time, or do you also train to react for when things go wrong?
That's a really good question. We are constantly training for reacting for when things go wrong. And we'll use simulators a lot, as the aviation industry does, to train for that. So certainly when you're learning to fly the Soyuz spacecraft, for example, all of your early training will be done in the simulator in Star City, just outside of Moscow. It's a safe environment. We're encouraged to make mistakes. We learn from failure, and that's a good thing. It's the best teacher, and it really teaches you the value of working together as a team and the value of having a really intimate knowledge of what you're doing. We have to do this in Russian as well, which for me was the hardest part of the training. Learning to fly helicopters was one thing, but learning a spacecraft in Russian was something altogether different. But yeah, we're certainly encouraged to make mistakes operating in this safe environment. But I think what's interesting is there was a period where our training was too safe, which probably sounds strange to say at a conference where we're talking about safety. If you can make something safer, surely you should. But it depends what the end goal is. If the end goal is that somebody has to have the confidence to go on a spacewalk where it's just two people whose lives depend on one another, nobody else there to support them, that is not the environment to do things for the first time, to experience risk for the first time. And so we ended up having to build risk into our training program, because the end goal was to equip people adequately for the task that we wanted them to carry out. And so, for example, when we were caving, we actually actively told our instructors to, not be with us on certain stages of the cave development when we were ingressing, egressing. Very technical rope work, very demanding, with catastrophic consequences if you got it wrong. That could have been made safer. But the point was, we were trained, we were prepared, and now we had to get the confidence to go and execute the task, knowing that we could do it. And that was quite a big hurdle to get the Space Agency Training Department to embrace that level of risk and to allow us to experience that level of risk.
All of a sudden, Tim, a couple of hours in a helicopter simulator seems light sort of afternoon. But thank you for sharing that. Was there anything that wasn't covered in your training that you did subsequently encounter, or was it absolutely all taken care of?
The training is 2.5 years of intense training when you're assigned to a mission, and that's on top of at least a year and a half of basic training before that. So no, pretty much everything is covered. You would be surprised if it wasn't. And of course, just like the aviation industry, which we take our model, in spaceflight, we take the aviation industry as a model for how we do our risk management and how we conduct our training. So we debrief, and 20 years worth of astronauts returning from missions and debriefing in great depth and detail. It's a very well-oiled machine now. So astronauts are very well prepared for the mission that they're going to do. There are always some surprises, always things that break that you didn't expect to break. I was on a spacewalk with Tim Peake, for example, and he started having water coming into his helmet, which was an interesting emergency scenario. We had to get him back into the airlock in a hurry. So things clearly go wrong, but the training is all there. Although things might break that you don't expect to, your training it prepares you for that.
Fascinating, Tim. And I wanted to ask you a question about the airlock. When you're inside the airlock going out, is that more daunting than being outside trying to come into the airlock on the way back in?
Inside going out is more daunting. It's one of those things, isn't it? No matter how much you're trained and prepared, you always fear the unknown. That's where all the apprehension, the anxiety is. And the moment you start actually executing the task, all the nerves disappear, all the apprehension disappears, and you just get on with what you're trained to do. But those few moments of just kind of waiting in the airlock as we went down to vacuum, they were probably the most anxious and the most apprehensive for me.
But I think, I understand from your book, rewarded only moments later, because tell us a little bit about that spacewalk and the experience that you had once you were outside the space station.
It's absolutely incredible. At the moment the airlock hatch opened and Tim Peake went out first, and I then started passing out all of the equipment to him before actually being able to physically get out the airlock myself. But you lower yourself down into space, and there are a few moments where your body just has to remember that if you let go, you're not going to fall, because you're just looking down 400 kilometers below you at the Earth, moving at Mach 25. So it's quite a lot for the brain to absorb and to take in. And actually, it was quite nice because Tim Peake had to move off first, and we were kind of using this fishing reel technique where he had to slingshot my anchor before I could move, and that just gave me a couple of minutes just hanging around at the airlock, getting used to that view before I then moved away as well. So it allows the brain to get used to it. But it's absolutely incredible. And then we later on in the spacewalk, we had a few moments at the furthest end of the space station to watch the sun go down before we were able to get to work on the solar panels. And again, that was a few moments where we just got the cameras out and enjoyed floating there in the universe.
Well, thanks for giving us a sense of that, Tim. It sounds absolutely incredible. We're talking tomorrow about leadership, so I wonder if we can sort of shift from collaboration onto leadership, Tim. And I'm struck in your book how you describe yourself as a soldier, pilot, astronaut, and as a parent. And I think that's one of the things that you thought was most important to you. Can I ask you, how has becoming a parent, what's that taught you about leadership that perhaps being a soldier, a pilot, and an astronaut maybe hasn't?
Well, I think the interesting thing is it's listening, and I guess it was a lesson in leadership that I also had early on. I think that nobody is naturally goes out and knows how to lead. It's something that we learn throughout our lives, and a young leader learns by listening. I certainly did when I was on the streets of Northern Ireland as a young platoon commander, listening to my platoon sergeants, my corporals, and the riflemen beneath me as to how to improve as a leader. But as a father as well, it kind of reminds you again to listen, because more often than not, we develop an adult brain, and we have an adult way of thinking, and it's very easy to just disregard some of the childish things that are said. But when you actually listen to what they're saying, I've realized that sometimes they're right, and sometimes I need to remember what life is like from a child's perspective and to put myself in their shoes and to see things from a different viewpoint, which when you're a very busy adult running around doing things, it's sometimes difficult. And so that's reminded me, I think, as a parent, to be a better leader by always remembering to see things from other people's perspective, to put yourself in their shoes.
A cheeky question then, Tim. I think back in 2015, I wonder what was their perspective. I appreciate they're a bit younger, but what was their perspective as Dad tells them, I'm about to just nip out for 186 days. How did that conversation go?
An interesting one. Well, of course, it was something that it's quite insidious, because all their life, I have been an astronaut. I had just left the army when Thomas, my eldest, was born. So for the first 6 months of his life, I was a test pilot, but he won't remember that. So they have grown up knowing Dad to be an astronaut, seeing me go to work. I've taken them to work many, many times. They've seen all the modules of the space station. They've seen where I was going to eat and sleep. They've watched me practice spacewalking in the swimming pool. So it just was very, very natural for them, the fact that I would be going to space. They haven't known it any other way. And I think that made it much, much easier, because it almost wasn't a conversation that needed to be had. It was, of course, Daddy's going off up to space. That's what he does. That's his job. But I think my youngest didn't really believe it until he was actually stood there in Baikonur and the rocket lifted off. And I've watched the video back and seen the expression of it on his face and thought, there you go. Now you believe me. Because I think up until then he thought I was just pretending.
Well, I'm sure you're an absolute inspiration to both of your boys. And I know you've inspired and educated the next generation of sons and daughters, scientists and astronauts. What lessons could you share with our members, Tim, as we aim to look ahead and develop and equip the safety leaders in our industry of tomorrow?
Well, I think as we look to the future in terms of safety, it's a case of looking to what we're trying to achieve. Obviously, what is the safety environment that we want to achieve? What's the outcome that we want to achieve? And then finding a route map towards that, and embracing technology along the way, because the pace of technology today is changing so rapidly. And there are so many tools that are now available to us to embrace innovation, to improve safety. So I think it's a case of remaining well-informed, educated, and using all of the resources that are available, but not losing sight of the overall roadmap of what it is that you're trying to achieve and what is the route that you want to get there.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to just remind our audience that, of course, they can be putting questions in and we'll filter those out and then pass them on to Tim. And indeed, a number have come through, Tim. So if you don't mind, I'll cross over to some of these. So straight to the point then, how do you resolve arguments and personal conflicts with your fellow crew members in space?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, a very good question. And we spend a lot of time training what I guess the agencies call the soft skills, the teamwork, the leadership, the communication, so that we can avoid big clashes of personality when you're in a very confined space for 6 months. And that's something that the cave training really teaches us. We also spend 12 days living underwater, the photo behind me there, and that helps with those soft skills as well. And that's where you really get to know the people that you're going to be going to space with. But also it's about understanding you as a person and what kind of character you are and how you deal with stress and how you deal with anxiety. So when it comes to conflict resolution, I guess the first question is, do you even want to raise it? Is this something that is just water up a duck's back? Somebody might be having a bad day. I can handle it. They're in a bad mood, or I don't see things from their point of view, but I'm going to be the person who steps away from this. Let it slide. Tomorrow it'll be back to normal. Or is it a situation that cannot go without being addressed, in which case it's a more of a thought process as to how you want to address it, whether it's just as a kind of light remark, or whether it's in a more formal environment, or whether it's via another route, another crewmate, or via even mission control. There are various different avenues to addressing situations and problems, and we practice all of these and we train for all of these. But what really helps on the space station is that we're all like-minded individuals, and we've all gone through the same process. So frankly, the minute anybody raises something that is even mildly confrontational, everybody wants to rectify it. So everybody's like, great, all right, let's sit down, let's talk about it. This is a situation where we need to resolve whatever it is the issue that needs resolving. So I think it helps that everybody's gone through that same training. We all know what we need to achieve at the end of the day.
And you referenced, Tim, talking about those non-technical skills that we look at in training. But you touched on personal qualities there. What do you think are the key personal qualities that make a great astronaut?
You've got to be clearly compatible in terms of getting on with your crewmates. So communication skills are very, very important. You've got to be calm and level-headed. It doesn't help to be somebody who's opinionated or somebody who jumps to conclusions or hot-headed. That's clearly not the personality type that would pass the psychological profiling that we have to go through to become astronauts. So, astronauts are probably more thoughtful people, more considerate, and people who can get on very well in a number of different circumstances with a number of different people.
And I wonder, we all think of astronauts as being somehow superhuman, and you're describing some of those sort of super qualities, if you like. Is there room for vulnerability? Is there room for humility in there somewhere as your personal qualities?
Oh, absolutely, and modesty as well. I think is very important. Humility and these are characteristics as well that I think set people in good stead. Ultimately, it's about working together as a team. There isn't really room for egos, and it's all about people working towards that common objective, that common goal. Plus the fact you put the international environment in there as well, and you put the ability to have cultural, mix with different cultures and be able to overcome any cultural boundaries that there might be. But that's something that actually a lot of us as astronauts, we really take great pleasure from, as do so many people in businesses and industries where they work with international partners. It's one of the benefits of the job, and it's great to have Russian colleagues, Japanese colleagues, other Europeans, Americans, Canadians. It's part of what makes it a much richer and more rewarding environment to work in.
Tim, you mentioned training earlier on, and you pointed to the picture over your shoulder there, training underwater. What was your favourite part of training, and what was your worst? Or least favourite?
Yeah, no, I think for me, the favourite part of the training was, I loved all the practical training. That really appealed to the kind of person I am, the kind of skill sets that I had developed in my time in the Army, my time as a test pilot, learning about the space station as a vehicle. I just sort of ate up all the diagrams, thermal systems, cooling systems, electrical systems. For me, that was just test pilot heaven. So that side of the training was not a problem. Spacewalking training was probably the most fun, where we do that in a large swimming pool in Houston. We go down for 6 hours at a time in full spacesuits using the water for neutral buoyancy. So that's where we'll practice spacewalks over and over again. So that's great fun. And clearly things like the caving and going underwater, the Nemo missions as well. I just really enjoyed all of that practical training. For me, the worst was probably learning Russian language. It was definitely the hardest, without a shadow of a doubt. I'm not a natural linguist at all. And clearly we have to get our language skills up to quite a high level. So that was a struggle for me. And I think the other part that I didn't enjoy was just the amount of travel. You are away an awful lot of the time. It's a punishing 2.5-year schedule, even before you get to sit on top of a rocket. You're never in one country for more than 3 weeks at a time, and literally bouncing around the world to all these different centers, doing a lot of training.
The devil in me wanted to ask the next question in Russian, Tim, but that's absolutely not going to happen. But you mentioned earlier on the routine in the space station, and I think I picked up it's fairly full on. Somebody had asked a question, flying is sometimes described as 95% boredom interspersed with, 5% of excitement. But how structured was the routine on the ISS?
Yeah, the routine is very structured, and that actually helps. It helps us when we first get on board the space station to acclimatize and to get used to our new unusual working environment. I think we're all quite used to now working in an isolated environment after the last year here on Earth. But of course, for us, it was quite unusual when you first get up there in such a remote location. So the structure really helps because it makes sure that everybody knows what's happening and when it's happening. Actually, the structure and routine itself is a way of managing conflict because everybody knows who's using which exercise equipment, who's cleaning which modules when, who's doing which tasks, and it helps everything run incredibly smoothly. But sometimes you can be too structured, and we've learned over the years in space station operations that astronauts actually prefer to have flexibility in their day as well. It's nice to know exactly what you need to do, but sometimes you don't want every minute of every day prescribed. If you can actually be a little bit flexible and that gives you an element of control over your life, that helps you in unusual circumstances and situations. And so we try and also build flexibility in the tasks that we have to do within any working day so that astronauts can take a coffee break when they want to take a coffee break. If they're on an orbit where they want to find the pyramids and take some photos or a Great Wall of China or something, you've got the flexibility to do that within reason, within your day. But we are working very, very hard, and clearly there's an awful lot of jobs to be done on the space station.
I'd love to come back to some of those experimental works that you were doing, but you mentioned the photographs there. I imagine you've taken thousands of photographs. Have you got a favourite or a couple of favourites, and could you tell us what they are and why?
Yeah, I have taken thousands of photographs. I think I've got a mixture of favourites. I mean, some of for some reason, I just loved Patagonia from space, which is absolutely mesmerizing and beautiful to look down on the Andes and the ice fields of southern Patagonia. So I've probably got my fair share of photos of there. Also the aurora. It's just so ethereal that when you see the aurora, we were up in space when there was a particularly strong period of solar activity. So we were seeing the aurora about twice a week. And it's just incredible on such a large scale as well. So I have many, many photos of aurora and many photographs of the Patagonian ice fields.
And I guess seeing those sort of things helps your emotional well-being when you're up there. Questions come in: how do you prepare yourself emotionally for a mission like half a year on the space station? And how's your well-being managed during the course of that time? I assume there's a huge support network.
Yes, it's really important to have that in place, both for you and clearly for your family as well. So that's part of our training in terms of developing the support network on the ground, so that we make sure that we have a good family support network. And also we talk about the difficult things. We have the difficult conversations with our families before we go, not necessarily with the children, of course, if they're young, but certainly with your partners. And you make sure that everybody knows contingency plans should either something happen in space or should something happen on the ground when we are not able to help out. And that's probably the biggest weight on your mind when you're in space is not for your own safety or well-being. It's for the well-being of your family and loved ones back on Earth. So to help us with that environment, we have a weekly tag up with our flight surgeon, and twice a week we have a tag up with our psychologist. So we have different professional people at Mission Control who we can speak to, who are outside of the chain of command, and we can speak with in confidence about any problems that we might have or any issues with well-being. And that's very, very helpful. Also, once a week, we have a video conference call with our families. It's only supposed to last 20 minutes, but they usually go on for at least an hour. So that's always on a Sunday, and that's always great for morale as well. Plus the fact we can actually call any number, any time in the world that we want. We just go to our crew quarters, and through the laptops, voice over IP, we can ring any number. I have no idea who foots the bill, but it's great to be able to just go to the crew quarter and ring your mates from space.
Fantastic. Just coming back to that experimental work that you were talking about, and that seemed to make up, a huge part of the astronaut's day. You must have done so many different experiments whilst you were on the space station. What was the one that you think we're all going to hear about, and maybe is going to benefit us most, and you're most proud of participating in?
Yeah, well, I think the one that we're going to see the most of is protein crystal growth, and it's an experiment that we've really starting to realize the potential in the last 4 to 5 years. And to put this into perspective, one of the things that you can do in microgravity is you can grow very large and very pure crystals because you don't get sedimentation, you don't get fracturing from gravitational disturbances. And we can take disease-causing proteins like Parkinson's, like motor neurone disease. We can take those on board the space stations and then grow very, very large, very pure proteins of diseases. And the way the pharmaceutical companies then create a drug is to use like a 3D jigsaw puzzle of the drug that has to wrap around that protein crystal. And so the larger and the more pure the crystal, then the better the drug will be, the fewer side effects it will have, and the smaller doses we can give to patients. And we're doing some remarkable work, or pharmaceutical companies are doing some remarkable work into that, and having huge success in the drugs that they're developing. So I think that's an area of great potential for the space station. Material science, I mentioned earlier on, we can use things like the electromagnetic levitator, which is a great name for an experiment. And we can actually create metal alloys in space that you simply cannot create here on Earth. With elastic metal properties. And whilst we can't create that on Earth, we can bring them back and we can analyze them, and we can try and get our manufacturing processes here on Earth to get as close to that as possible. I mentioned about light, strong turbine blades for engine aircraft, for example. So that's some exciting research that we're doing.
Great, thanks, Tim. I'm going to change tack slightly. Somebody's asked, single point failures are something that our industry is very keen to address. Indeed, it's a HeliOffshore priority. What single point failures do you have to consider when you're up in space, and how do you manage and mitigate them?
Yes, that's a great question. And of course, we try and build as much redundancy into our operations, just like the aviation industry as well. There are three big emergencies that we're concerned about in space. And of those, I think if you ask any astronaut, they would say that the greatest risk whilst we're in space is being struck by debris. A single point of failure is really the fact that we have shielded a lot of the pressurized modules by bulletproof shielding, which can protect us from debris up to about 1 centimeter. And our ground stations are tracking debris from about 5 centimeters or larger. So we have a black hole there, a gap between 1 and 5 centimeters, where we simply don't know if it's coming, and if it hits us, it will go straight through. So that it would be, obviously a catastrophic incident for the space station. And we practice depressurization drills a number of times before we fly to space, along with fire drills and toxic atmosphere are the other two big emergencies that we've got. But wherever possible, we're constantly trying to build in as much redundancy to our operations as possible.
And I guess that in aviation, that reminds me, we learn, I suppose, from close calls, don't we? The close calls we've had and our colleagues have had. Any close calls yourself, or is it all so well controlled?
No, I mean we had a close call on docking, in fact, and it's interesting that even now, after having space station operations for so long, we're still learning and we're still making mistakes and we're still improving things. But we had a failure that caused an abort of the automatic system. So Yuri, our Russian commander, had to take control, fly us back in from manual docking. And it was a particularly demanding task because the sun was setting behind us and the light was reflecting straight back off the space station into all the optics. So Yuri really couldn't see much through the optics. And at the same time, the computer system crashed. And it was one of those Swiss cheese models that the aviation industry is very familiar with. It's never one emergency. It's several emergencies stacking up. And all three of us are pilots in the Soyuz. And we recognize that, hang on, we've got multiple emergencies stacking up here. And Yuri was coming in off axis, drifting down the space station with a high closure rate, recognized that dangerous situation. And despite pressure from the ground to continue, backed off back into space and said, no, we need to get this all sorted, bring it back in. Because of that, actually, the subsequent analysis of that emergency sequence we have now built in holds on the approach for a manual docking. So you used to just go straight in on a manual docking, drive straight in, and now there are mandatory hold points to be able to come to a full stop, analyze the situation, and agree to continue on. So yes, we're still learning, we're still debriefing, and we're still implementing change to improve safety.
And that learning and the debriefing, Tim, is that very immediate after an event? How do you institutionalise that learning? Do you have sort of forums where everybody gets together, or is it very immediate after the event?
It's kind of informal and formal as well, and it happens on different levels. As a crew, we would do what you would expect as a crew, and that's just to have a chat about it, over a cup of tea, and like say, right, let's go through this in detail. What went wrong? Let's analyse this and formulate a report. But at a much higher level, of course, this is being analysed by mission control as well. And so really you don't get the full debrief until we finish the space flight and we come back, and we actually all as a crew would go to Moscow, and as a crew we'll go to Houston and to Munich, and we'll have debriefs with all of the relevant safety centers to make sure these points are captured. So there's kind of the immediate debrief to make sure that any immediate safety concerns are addressed, and then there are further debriefs down the line.
Thanks, Tim. And a question coming in a little bit about back to the competition side, I think. Is Tim excited about the prospects that SpaceX and similar projects can bring to space exploration?
Yeah, I'm hugely excited about what SpaceX is doing and what they're bringing to the competition, because when you think about it in terms of the shuttle, it used to cost $54,000 to fly 1 kilogram into orbit on the shuttle. SpaceX have brought that down to less than $3,000 now, and they expect to bring it down another order of magnitude in the next 5 years. So that's opening up space to so many people, so many industries, so many universities, so many commercial opportunities to be able to utilize space. And that's very exciting. They're also doing it in a more sustainable way by recycling, as many parts of the rocket as possible. Thomas Pesquet, my French classmate, flew to space a couple of weeks ago on the Dragon SpaceX, and their booster was on its 9th trip, which we would have never have considered for a human-rated vehicle, that we would reuse components to that degree. So I think it's very exciting what they're doing using innovation in improving access to space. And of course, they'll be key players in our plans to return to the moon and to go on to Mars as well. And I think it is important that we open space out to the commercial market, but we've got to do it in a responsible way. And we have got to make sure that it's regulated and controlled as well. And I think that's where my concerns lie at the moment, is we haven't quite got the regulations and the controls in place on an international scale to manage space. So, for example, space debris and mega constellations, for example, the 5G networks. These kind of areas are things that the United Nations have an outer space treaty of 1967, but it's not mandatory. It's guidelines for people to follow. And I think that we're now at the stage where we need to be implementing mandatory regulations for any spaceflight companies.
I was going to ask you, and you're talking about being excited, do you fancy a trip on the Mars One project too?
I think when we go to Mars, we need to be returning our crews for sure. The whole one-way mission to Mars has never been something that has appealed to anybody in the professional industry, I don't think. But certainly, yeah, missions to Mars, I think, are set for the 2030s. I think the 2020s is we're going to see a return to the moon. We're going to see a permanent habitation modules on the surface of the moon, a small space station in orbit around the moon, which will be able to facilitate various different landing sites, which will be very exciting. And whereas today we watch astronauts go off for a 6-month mission on the space station, I think by 2028 we'll be seeing astronauts go off for a 6-month mission to a lunar base. And then that sets the stage for the 2030s, which will be heading off to Mars.
And space tourism, of course, is on the up now as well. Is that a good thing, or does it trivialise the sort of the space exploration endeavour?
I don't think it trivializes it. I think it's inevitable, actually, that, it's a bit like the aviation industry, whereas in the early days it would be professionals learning how to fly and operating, and then of course aviation has become a hobby and a sport for so many people, and so many people are passionate about it as well. I think you'll always have the professional strand of astronauts who are conducting exploration on behalf of organizations or space agencies. And I think you'll have that now, the ability for people to go and experience spaceflight for fun. We're seeing the suborbital companies getting ready for their first customers potentially this year, with Virgin Galactic, with Blue Origin, for example, and SpaceX, carrying their first customers to space as well, into orbit. And we've already seen several space tourists fly on the Soyuz spacecraft to the space station. So it's something that at the moment is an activity for high net worth individuals. But again, aviation was an very, very expensive endeavor back in the 1920s. And now, most people can afford to fly somewhere on a foreign holiday. So I think in the future, spaceflight will be open to a much, much larger market.
Oh, well, look forward to it, definitely. Tim, if I can bring us down to earth, and I am paid to use that particular pun, you must have experienced some periods of physical isolation, perhaps extreme isolation in space. And did that prepare you in any way for the separation and the pandemic of what we've all just experienced, the global lockdown?
I think in a way it does. It certainly, coming back from space, it gives you a fresh perspective. And in terms of living in isolation, as I mentioned about that kind of structure and routine, it was one of the first things I did at home, was say, okay, we're all living under the same roof. We all just need to know when we're doing things, when people have got, the schedule they have to stick to, or when people can have freedom and flexibility to do what they want. Living in a house with 2 children and having to do homeschooling as well as running jobs, then you need to have that kind of structure and routine so that everybody knows what's happening and when. And I think with young people as well, it really helps them. They like knowing what's happening and when it's happening. And some people who think structure and routine it's a very rigid, inflexible system, but actually it's liberating, because if you know that you have got 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour of free time in which you can do whatever you want, then that structure and routine actually gives you the time that you need, and it enforces you to either exercise, either to eat well, or to go to bed on time and to get the necessary rest. And when your place of work and your place of home are the same, it's so important to be able to switch off and relax. And I think structure helps that. So I do think that living on board the space station taught me many lessons about how to live in lockdown and to manage it.
And sort of taking those lessons from space, then, if you were to go back to young Tim Peake going into Sandhurst, looking back, what lessons would you tell yourself, and looking back on what you've experienced?
Oh, well, I certainly would say don't change anything, because it worked out okay. But I think that, I would probably say, have self-belief, have self-confidence, and grasp every opportunity that comes along. And that's what I would certainly say to any young people today is those 3 things.
And is that key, Tim? Because in your book you say that the gap between ordinary and extraordinary is perhaps narrower than we might otherwise think. Is that true then? How would you advise people to make that transition themselves?
I think it is a lot narrower. We'll have to be honest here as well. There's luck and fate plays a part in this. I was lucky. I was in the right time in the right place, because astronaut selections don't come around that often. So for me, it was good timing. But also, it was a case of grasping those opportunities along the way. If I hadn't done all those activities as a young person, I wouldn't have got those experiences, whether it was Operation Rally to Alaska, whether it was Scouts, whether it was flying scholarships that set up my aviation career, and pursuing my education as well, despite having not gone to university, thinking I needed to get a degree. 33 years old, let's go and get a degree. And looking back, I can see how pursuing those opportunities set me up for being able to do something that I didn't even realize I was going to have the opportunity to do. So I think we can always look to better ourselves. And I think that it's all about fulfilling your potential. And that's, again, something I try and say to young people when I'm speaking to them. It's about having that confidence and self-belief, because you can give so much, you can do so much. You just need to get out there and do it and not be afraid of putting yourself outside your comfort zone. That's what it's all about. If you stay inside your comfort zone, you'll never learn anything.
How do you feel, Tim? You're a highly skilled pilot. How do you feel about the comfort zone that we're all sort of wrestling with, the rapid emergence of remotely piloted and autonomous aircraft? It's changing the face of what we do. How do you feel about that?
It is, and again, it's one of these things I kind of came back to when I was talking about the pace of technology and how fast it's changing. And it's difficult now to not just keep up, but to try and stay one step ahead, to try and analyze what's happening in the future and how we need to be prepared for it, and to make sure that we are structuring the regulations so that we can operate safely in this environment with all this technology around. I had the opportunity to fly the jetpack recently, and I was speaking to Richard Browning from Gravity Industries, and I was saying, how did you get on with the CAA? And he was telling me about the conversation he had, and the CAA kind of came along and said, well, actually, you don't really fall under our jurisdiction in terms of your weight category, etc. So again, it's this kind of technology is going so quickly, and people are doing things that we need to be able to try and stay one step ahead and make sure that we're all operating in a safe environment. But I do think the aviation industry is incredibly well equipped for that, partly because there's been a lot of hard lessons learned over the years, and we've become so much better at things like crew resource management, at risk management, and understanding how complex systems need to operate.
Thank you, Tim. And not only is technology catching up with us, but I'm afraid time is as well. We have to look at towards this session closing. But can I ask you just for your final reflection, as a helicopter test pilot, as one of us maybe, we're thinking about how we might build an open, aligned and responsive industry so that no lives are lost in our sector in offshore aviation. Can you give us your reflections on how we might just go about that?
I think it's whenever you have these kind of systems, it's all about having people really trust the system that you're trying to enforce, and having people use it. So it's something that has to be from the grassroots up, really, and have everyone's buy-in. I know, people don't like that word buy-in, but I can't think of a better example that we need to use though. But it's about everybody having buy-in into this system, so that it's something that people realize the value of it, people are willing to contribute to it, and using honesty and integrity really as the overarching theme for making sure that we record lessons that are learned, and we make sure that they don't happen again in the future.
Tim, thank you so much. I'm afraid time has beaten us, but a huge thank you to you for your time today. It's wonderful hearing what is an incredibly unique perspective, and you've really enriched our safety conversation. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute privilege, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed it myself.
Bye for now.